Andy Sloan wasn't the kind of man who ever expected peace to come without conditions. After 30 years of designing high-security storage systems for government agencies and private defense contractors, he had learned that true security was never about walls or locks. It was about preparedness, vigilance, and, most of all, foresight. After selling his last patent and quietly bowing out of the industry that had taken more than it gave, Andy didn't retire in the conventional sense. He didn't buy a lake house or spend afternoons golfing or drinking light beer with men trying to remember who they used to be. Instead, he bought an acre and a half of unincorporated land just outside of town, in that in-between space where jurisdiction blurred and public records were filed once and forgotten. The property came with a modest 2-story brick house, tucked behind a stretch of cedar and oak that shielded it from the road. The previous owner had started renovations but never finished. That suited Andy fine. He preferred to do things his way, with his hands and on his time. Over the course of 6 months, he rebuilt everything from the foundation to the roofing infrastructure. Not because it needed to be done, but because he needed to know, down to the bolt, what his house could withstand. Every wall, every door frame, every hidden alcove was part of a larger logic. He installed reinforced storage units in the basement, tuned ventilation to compensate for thermal fluctuation, and connected his power system to an independent solar array with buried battery redundancy. He ran Cat6 wiring through the walls for a hardline private network. He didn't advertise his background to anyone, and he sure as hell didn't invite questions. Andy wasn't hiding. He just didn't believe in relying on others when it came to what mattered. His weapons collection was not excessive, but it was deliberate. A mix of practical firearms, bolt-action, semi-automatics, and a few historic pieces, each registered, secured, and stored in accordance with state and federal law. This wasn't a cache. It wasn't a statement. It was precision. Tools maintained and locked for worst-case contingencies he hoped would never come. Andy wasn't paranoid. He was pragmatic. There's a difference. The neighborhood he settled near was technically not a neighborhood at all. It was a string of semi-rural properties that had only recently begun to attract urban spillover. Most residents were older, quiet people who didn't want to be found, or younger families looking to stretch their dollar beyond the reach of city taxes. About a quarter-mile up the road was a cul-de-sac development that advertised itself as a private managed community, though Andy had done his homework and found that their legal charter didn't extend past their gate. That didn't stop them from trying to act like it did. On 3 separate occasions during the first year, Andy had received letters from their so-called Residential Safety Board asking for his participation in collective safety obligations. He ignored them. There was nothing enforceable about their language and no authority behind their postage. Then, for nearly a year, there was silence. Andy went about his work, kept his routines. He rarely saw his neighbors and preferred it that way. Once in a while, he'd help the older woman down the road with her generator or answer a question from a confused delivery driver who missed his turn. But for the most part, he kept to himself. He maintained his systems, took daily notes, logged maintenance cycles, and kept his property in better shape than any mandated code ever required. If anyone had a problem with him, they never said it to his face. But things changed subtly one spring morning. It was something he almost didn't notice. As he was walking the property perimeter, checking for any weather-related damage to his fencing, he saw a golf cart parked just outside the tree line across the drainage ditch. 3 men sat inside it, 2 in the front, 1 in the back, all dressed in matching navy windbreakers with reflective patches that simply read, "Community Oversight." They weren't facing him. They were looking at something on a tablet between them, pointing occasionally toward the direction of his house. Andy stood still, just at the edge of the clearing, watching. They didn't seem to notice him. After a minute, the cart turned and drove slowly back toward the cul-de-sac, disappearing around the bend. Andy didn't approach. He didn't take pictures. He didn't call anyone. Instead, he went back inside and noted the time, direction, and weather conditions in his logbook. He reviewed the footage from his driveway cameras. Nothing unusual there, but he realized he had no angle covering the tree line from that distance. So he installed one. Not out of fear, but out of procedure. Over the next few weeks, the visits became more frequent. Always during the day, always slow-moving, always the same type of vehicle with different occupants, never more than 3. They never entered his property. They never approached his house. But they lingered. Always just close enough to be noticed, but never long enough to be confronted. Andy adjusted his perimeter accordingly. He didn't mention it to anyone. He didn't want attention, and he wasn't the type to speculate. The first real breach didn't come from the road. It came from the ground. Early one Saturday, while inspecting the southwest drainage trench that bordered his property line, Andy found a small device buried in the soil. At first glance, it looked like a discarded rotor, sleek, plastic, embedded with an LED that blinked red every 6 seconds. It wasn't broadcasting a Wi-Fi signal, at least not one his equipment could detect. But it wasn't dead, either. It was transmitting something. Frequency unknown, likely encrypted. He didn't dismantle it on the spot. He didn't throw it out. He simply extracted it with care, placed it in a signal-proof container, and logged the GPS location where it had been found. Then he swept the property for others. He found 2 more within 3 hours, both similarly buried, one of them less than 10 feet from his basement wall. Still, he didn't call anyone. Instead, Andy compiled his documentation, cross-referenced time-stamped recordings from his property sensors, and initiated a Level 3 lockdown on his interior systems. No alerts, no posts, no drama, just containment. The golf carts stopped coming. The quiet resumed. But the feeling didn't. 2 weeks passed without incident, until a Tuesday morning in early May, when 3 men showed up at his front gate. They weren't dressed in uniforms. They weren't wearing windbreakers. They looked like municipal contractors, high-vis vests, utility belts, and a clipboard. But there were no trucks, no markings, no posted work orders. The one in the middle, tall and shaved bald, approached the intercom and pressed the call button. Andy watched from inside, silent, before answering through the speaker. "Can I help you?" "Yes, sir," the bald man said, his tone rehearsed and professional. "We're from the District Coordination Office. We've received a notification regarding non-compliant asset storage on this property." Andy let that hang for a second. "I didn't request an inspection," he replied. "It's not a request," the man said evenly. "This is a part of a regional compliance sweep. We'll need to review any and all firearms currently held on site. You can accompany us during verification, standard operating procedure." Andy paused again. No logos on their clothing. No vehicle in sight. No jurisdictional authority. "What statute are you referencing?" he asked. There was a pause, fractional but telling. "District Code 18B, the man replied. Andy exhaled slowly, inaudible over the mic. "Leave the clipboard by the gate," he said. "I'll review it. That's all." "We can't leave until we've conducted a visual," the man replied, his tone tightening slightly. "Then I suggest you call the sheriff," Andy said. "Because you're not coming on my property." There was another pause, longer this time. The men exchanged looks, then turned and walked back toward the road, disappearing from view. Andy didn't move. He stood by the monitor and watched the gate feed for 27 minutes after they left. And then he started preparing. The day after the uninvited visitors appeared at Andy's gate, he conducted a full sweep of the perimeter before sunrise. With a heavy-duty flashlight in one hand and his reinforced steel-toe boots crunching softly over gravel and dew-slick grass, he moved slowly and methodically, noting every disturbed patch of soil, every new tire mark, every inconsistency in the gravel bed by the gate. He didn't find anything overtly new, no fresh devices or signs of forced entry, but something lingered in the air like static, an anticipation or perhaps a warning. He double-checked his surveillance logs, backed up the files locally into 2 off-site encrypted drives, then reviewed every second of video from the day prior. The audio confirmed what he already knew. The men were deliberate, calm, trained to speak with authority without raising suspicion. But their posture betrayed something else. They weren't government. They weren't law enforcement. They were contractors, or worse, civilians who thought they could wear the skin of authority and get away with it. Later that afternoon, Andy received a manila envelope in his mailbox. There was no stamp, no return address, just his name printed in block letters. Inside was a single page typed in faux official formatting, referencing a community initiative for secure asset review, and citing a completely fabricated executive mandate from a non-existent oversight board. The document contained no legal letterhead, no ordinance reference, no contact numbers, only a time and date. Final opportunity for voluntary compliance, Thursday, 0900 hours. Andy read it 3 times, then folded it neatly, slid it into a transparent evidence sleeve, and placed it with the growing folder of materials he had begun collecting. He didn't panic, and he didn't make the mistake of underestimating the situation either. There was a pattern forming, a deliberate one, and he knew better than to confront it emotionally. That evening, Andy contacted Daniel Pike, a security consultant and former contractor who now worked exclusively as an evidence verification specialist for legal counsel. Dan wasn't a private investigator, and he wasn't cheap, but he was thorough, and more importantly, he didn't ask unnecessary questions. Andy didn't offer speculation. He sent the materials, the footage, and a detailed incident log without commentary. The only subject line of the email read, "Requesting forensic verification and escalation pathway." Within the hour, Dan responded with a 3-sentence email. "These are not affiliated with any known agency. This is a coordinated civilian campaign disguised under jurisdictional camouflage. Recommend you go to hard perimeter and escalate to retained counsel immediately." Andy had expected as much, but seeing it in writing crystallized the severity. By Wednesday morning, Andy received word from his lawyer, Anna Keene. She specialized in property rights and unlawful enforcement protocols. She reviewed Dan's findings, including metadata analysis on the so-called mandate letter, and confirmed that not only was it fraudulent, but the typographic style and formatting suggested it had been composed using a template commonly found on legal document simulation websites. In other words, these people weren't even careful. They were arrogant. That afternoon, Anna filed a preemptive declaration of non-consent with the county clerk's office, effectively logging Andy's position on record. If anything were to occur on or near his property, the documentation would serve as the first legal tripwire. Despite the legal preparation, Andy didn't underestimate the physical aspect of what might come next. On Thursday, well before 0900, he rose and checked all camera feeds, sensors, and reinforcement zones. He donned his reinforced workwear, not combat gear, just his standard tactical utility setup, and loaded a thermal monitor into his chest pocket. By 8:30, he had deployed small visible signage along the fence line. No trespassing, armed response authorized by state law, all activity recorded. It wasn't an escalation, it was a reminder. At precisely 8:57, the now familiar electric whine of a golf cart reached his ears. He watched through a side-mounted exterior mirror as the vehicle slowed to a stop at the far end of his gravel drive. The same 3 figures disembarked. They were dressed differently now. 2 wore collared polos with embroidered patches that read Community Infrastructure, while the third carried a black binder and wore aviator sunglasses despite the overcast sky. Andy didn't move from his position. He let the intercom pick up the audio, recording everything. The man with the binder approached the gate and pressed the call button, his tone unchanged from before, calm, bureaucratic, professionally bored. "Mr. Sloan, this is your final notice for voluntary compliance. Please present any regulated materials for remote storage verification." Andy replied without delay. "You're on private property, and you've already been warned once. If you remain past this point, it will be recorded as intentional trespassing. The county is aware of your prior visit. Your documentation has been filed with legal counsel. If you persist, I'll assume you're acting outside the law." There was a beat of silence. The man with the sunglasses turned his head slightly, whispering something to the others. Then he leaned in toward the intercom, his voice lowered but still controlled. "Mr. Sloan, we're authorized to collect unsecured materials under the community safety provision. If you resist—" "No, you're not," Andy cut in flatly. "There's no such provision in this jurisdiction. You have no warrant, no agency affiliation, and no jurisdictional authority. Leave the premises now." The men stood there another few seconds. Then the one with the binder reached up and, with a casual flick of his wrist, dropped a small object over the gate. It landed softly in the dirt beside the pathway. Andy didn't react outwardly, but his eyes narrowed as he watched it bounce twice and roll to a stop. It was a tracker, the kind embedded in package delivery services and fleet vehicles. Without another word, the three men turned, re-entered the golf cart, and disappeared down the road. Andy stepped outside 5 minutes later. His property was clear, silent, still. He approached the small black device, retrieved it with tongs, and sealed it inside a steel-lined evidence box. He then reviewed the nearby camera footage and confirmed what he suspected. The device activated on contact. It had pulsed once, then gone silent. A live beacon. His property had been tagged. Not for law enforcement, for mapping. Someone was trying to build a digital signature of his perimeter. That evening, Anna called him. She had spoken to a friend in the state regulatory board who confirmed that similar incidents had been reported across the region in unincorporated areas, almost all involving non-standard enforcement actions by unverified groups posing as civilian authority. The targets varied. Some were elderly, some gun owners, some reclusive landowners. The pattern suggested something coordinated. Targeted exploitation of weak enforcement zones where jurisdiction was minimal and oversight even less. "They're testing limits," Anna said, "and they're betting most people won't push back. You did. That puts you on their radar, but it also means they'll change tactics. Be ready." Andy didn't sleep much that night. Not from fear, but calculation. He had options, but most importantly, he now understood the game. They weren't interested in dialogue. They were performing pressure tests, soft invasions under the guise of community interest. It wasn't just about weapons. It was about access, compliance, leverage, and Andy had no intention of offering any. The weekend arrived in silence, but Andy knew better than to trust stillness after movement. The men hadn't returned. No other vehicles had passed his driveway, and no new notices appeared in his mailbox. Yet he could feel the pressure like a low hum beneath the surface. Surveillance didn't stop when footsteps retreated. It only changed posture. On Saturday morning, while walking the south fence line with his tablet scanner connected to a spectral frequency analyzer, Andy detected a narrowband burst emanating from just outside his eastern property boundary. It was irregular, layered, and very deliberately masked to mimic telemetry pings from standard smart irrigation controllers. But it was too consistent, too purposefully brief. Whoever placed it was covering their tracks not just physically, but electromagnetically. Andy didn't dismantle it. Instead, he reoriented one of his camera arrays and rerouted a monitoring node to track transmissions passively. The less he touched, the more they would show. That evening, he initiated a low-energy, wide-band decoy pulse from the basement. simulating the electromagnetic signature of a poorly shielded arms locker. A bait pulse. Then he waited. The next morning, at 5:12 a.m., one of his perimeter cameras captured a shadow. A tall figure with a hooded jacket, crouched low, approaching the east line on foot. No vehicle, no flashlight. Just the rhythm of someone who had walked this ground before. The figure stopped beside the tree line, lifted something from the ground, possibly a field reader or data logger, and remained crouched for nearly 45 seconds. Then, just before disappearing into the darkness again, the figure looked directly at the camera, even though the unit was invisible at that angle. That confirmed it. They knew the layout. They had studied his angles. Someone had mapped his defenses. Andy did not call law enforcement. Not yet. He compiled the footage, layered it with time-stamped transmission logs, and sent a silent, encrypted burst to Anna and Dan. Then he drove into town, not to file a report, but to pick up industrial-grade thermal insulation panels, the kind used in environmental test chambers. That night, he began installing them in his basement ceiling and along select walls. Not because he was afraid of being watched, but because the methods used against him were now moving beyond imitation. They were entering the territory of practiced intrusion. The following week brought no immediate escalation, but the calm was heavier than before. The weather turned humid, clouds hung low, and the air carried the weight of an unfinished conversation. On Tuesday afternoon, a utility crew appeared at the base of the road near Andy's property. No markings, no announcement. A single, unbranded van. 2 men in navy coveralls unloading what looked like conduit and a spool of fiber. Andy watched them from his upstairs window. They didn't approach, didn't say a word, just worked slowly and steadily. When he walked out to the edge of his drive, they glanced up but didn't engage. He asked who they were contracted through. One of them muttered, "Regional network upgrade." The other avoided eye contact. No paperwork, no county notice. Andy documented everything. Vehicle plates, tool serials, directional cable markings. When he checked with the county office later that day, there were no registered permits for infrastructure work in that zone. That night, his internet service went down. No warning, no outage alert. A clean drop, but only the inbound connection. Outbound signals still pushed through, routed unusually fast, as though mirrored. Andy severed the line manually and fell back to satellite redundancy. Before logging off, he noticed that the local area IP node used to route his service had changed subdomain registrars. It now listed a hosting proxy from Nevada. The following morning, Andy returned from a trip into town to find that someone had entered the unsealed utility corridor on the west side of his property, the one that ran beneath the retaining wall. The entry lock wasn't broken, but it had been disturbed. Slight dust displacement, microscopic drag marks. He checked the motion logs, nothing recorded. That only confirmed his suspicion. Someone had walked that line precisely within the camera's rotation dead zone, exploiting the hardware refresh window. He had built his system with redundancies, but no system is perfect when someone has a full schematic. That afternoon, Anna called. Dan had pulled footage from a similar property 2 counties over. Same golf carts, same non-affiliated personnel. In that case, the owners were elderly. Their home was entered under pretenses of fire code inspections, due to proximity to dry brush areas. No warrant, no paperwork, just urgency and uniforms. Within a week, half of the owner's assets had been seized by a community safety escrow authority that didn't exist in any registry. It was becoming clear that this wasn't harassment. This was a playbook. Anna's voice hardened. "They're modeling your reaction, Andy. You didn't crack. You documented, you fortified, and you isolated. That means they're going to shift into provocation mode." He knew what that meant. Direct contact. Missteps designed to trigger legal overreach or draw him into confrontation. He couldn't afford that. They needed him to make a mistake so they could justify the next phase. On Thursday evening, a black SUV pulled into the access road just past dusk. Andy was already on alert. His cameras flagged the vehicle as a match to a private security contractor registered in another state, a known shell used in industrial land repossession operations. The vehicle idled for nearly 12 minutes. No one got out. Then it slowly backed out and left. No headlights, no noise. That was the signal. They were about to make their next move, and they did, just after midnight. Andy had fallen asleep for less than 2 hours when the silent alarm tripped. A weight shift on the southwest service path measured by a pressure sensor he had installed for monitoring erosion. He was on his feet instantly, eyes scanning the live feeds. 2 men, both in dark clothing, one carrying what looked like a slim pry bar. They were trying to access the sub-panel beside the water relay switch. That wasn't just vandalism. That was utility sabotage. Andy activated the perimeter lights. Not the motion-triggered ones, but the manual halogens tied to the auxiliary generator. The property lit up in stark white, the way a surgical theater does before a cut. The men froze. One ran immediately, disappearing into the trees. The other hesitated, caught mid-motion, unsure if he'd been seen. Andy didn't engage. He didn't need to. He triggered the voice module through the nearest exterior speaker. "You've been recorded. You're trespassing on private property protected under state statute. Leave now, or law enforcement will be dispatched with a criminal complaint and supporting footage." The man bolted. Andy didn't chase. He watched the feed until the woods were still again. Then he logged the footage, filed a silent alert to Anna, and began locking down every unsecured panel, every exterior junction. This was no longer a slow pressure campaign. It was coordinated penetration. But the real shift came the next day. At 11:03 a.m., he received a legal packet via courier, not mail. Inside was a cease and desist order accusing him of interfering with community safety operations and demanding the removal of unauthorized barriers impeding compliance officers. The return address? A law firm in a different state, previously used in civil asset forfeiture cases involving utility claims. It was an escalation, not from force, but from paper. The kind of attack that tried to cloak aggression in legalese. They weren't just testing him physically anymore. They were trying to bind him in red tape. He knew what this meant. They were coming back. And this time, it wouldn't be to knock. Andy had always understood the difference between visibility and exposure. Most people think they're the same, but in reality, being seen is one thing. Being vulnerable is another. As the situation around his property escalated from probing visits and buried devices to legal maneuvers and attempted sabotage, Andy reached a quiet but final conclusion. Whoever was behind this operation wasn't trying to intimidate him into compliance. They were trying to wear him down, force him into a mistake, and isolate him until he became just another number in a quiet, unreported process. The strategy was clear. It wasn't about storming in. It was about surgically eroding resistance. That meant the next logical step for Andy was neither confrontation nor retreat. It was strategic transparency. Not to his enemies, but to the right people. He didn't call the sheriff. He didn't trust a system that had, so far, provided no proactive support. Instead, he contacted someone from his past, Marla Hendricks, a defense investigator turned analyst who now worked as a freelance liaison between private security firms and insurance risk management branches. Marla wasn't law enforcement, but she had access to databases that weren't public and eyes in networks that rarely left footprints. They hadn't spoken in over 5 years, not since a contract dispute had forced Andy out of a multi-agency project on perimeter defense systems. But he knew she still respected his work. More importantly, she still owed him a favor. He sent her the entire file: videos, photographs, document scans, encrypted traffic logs, tracker schematics, and metadata reports from the communication anomalies he'd recorded. He didn't ask her to do anything illegal. He asked for a pattern check, overlaying his data with incidents in other states. 48 hours later, she called him back with a low, urgent tone that said more than any file could. There were 13 other properties across 5 states that had reported nearly identical events over the last 18 months. No official investigations had gone anywhere. In most cases, the victims had either moved, settled quietly, or filed insurance claims after suffering loss due to compliance violations. But what shocked Marla wasn't just the replication of tactics. It was the timing. In every case, the target received a cease and desist letter between day 25 and day 30 of initial contact. Andy had received his on day 27. That night, Andy didn't reinforce his windows. He didn't install more motion sensors. He made tea, sat in the middle of his house, and let the stillness wrap around him. He understood now that this wasn't an isolated shakedown. It was a networked campaign. He wasn't being targeted because of what he did. He was being targeted because of how he'd responded. Calm, deliberate, documented. He represented the variable they hadn't accounted for, and if he cracked, they'd win more than his property. They'd win the ability to cite his case as precedent. So he changed his stance. The next morning, he visited 3 of his neighbors, not the ones closest to him, but those on the edge of the unincorporated line. He asked them, without drama, if they had experienced any unusual visits, inspections, or paperwork. One of them, a retired postal worker named Bill, hesitated before answering. His voice was quiet. He admitted that a group of men had shown up at his gate weeks earlier, asking to inventory safety hazards in exchange for waived inspection fees. Bill had let them onto the property. They told him he had to remove his propane tanks or pay a fine. He complied. He hadn't questioned it until now. Another neighbor, a young couple with 3 kids, confessed they'd been told their outdoor play structure was violating community risk compliance standards. When Andy asked who issued the warning, they showed him a paper with the same formatting as his own fake compliance notice. By the end of the day, Andy had compiled 5 such encounters. Not all were identical, but the tone, the language, the vagueness of the supposed statutes, it was all cut from the same cloth. He didn't record anyone. He didn't organize a meeting. That wasn't his job, but what he did do was file an updated affidavit with Anna, expanding his case from personal targeting to coordinated regional interference. This changed things. Now it wasn't a homeowner under pressure, it was a jurisdiction under breach. That night the air changed again. Andy felt it even before his sensors registered motion. At 2:41 a.m., his interior alarm registered an anomaly, an override ping that shouldn't have existed. It wasn't a break-in. It wasn't a power loss. It was a handshake request, broadcast at short range, trying to mimic his system's internal service check protocol. Whoever had created it had intimate knowledge of his model's firmware. It failed to breach, but it succeeded in one thing. It told Andy, without a doubt, that the people targeting him weren't guessing anymore. They had infrastructure. They had tools. They had inside information. He didn't wait for daylight. He activated full isolation mode on his system, severing it from even his satellite backup. Then he opened the lead line drawer under his workbench and removed a sealed packet containing a data shard, an offline snapshot of every security setting, build log, firmware path, and backup from his entire property network, a contingency he had hoped never to need. He placed it in a secondary drone-mounted storage module and prepared it for delivery. By noon, the packet was on its way to Marla. By nightfall, she called him back, her voice sharp and controlled. "You have compromised code. That handshake? It's not civilian. It's lifted from a secure firmware update issued last year to several high-value infrastructure partners. One of them was used by a firm that's now been dissolved. Guess who bought their assets? A shell company out of Delaware, which also happens to be linked to the same address as the law firm that sent your cease and desist. Andy didn't curse. He didn't panic. He simply asked one question. "What's the objective?" Marla paused. Then she said it. "They're looking for clean precedents. Cases where people surrendered access without legal resistance. Once they get enough, they'll start formalizing it as policy. You're not just a target, Andy. You're a test run." That was the pivot point. He wasn't just defending his house anymore. He was defending the blueprint they wanted to use against everyone else. Andy had long believed that real danger never came with a dramatic opening. No slamming doors, no raised voices, no declaration of war. The real danger seeped in quietly, like water beneath a foundation, corroding slowly until the damage was too deep to patch. And now, with confirmation that his system had been probed using firmware-exclusive handshakes sourced from a shell corporation that had quietly absorbed dissolved assets of a surveillance vendor, he understood that the game had changed again. They no longer needed pretext. They weren't checking his reactions. They were advancing the operation toward whatever came after coercion, forced control disguised as inevitability. The morning after the handshake attempt, Andy woke early to conduct a quiet reformatting of his home's internal security framework. He didn't just rotate codes or change access logs. He physically removed storage clusters, updated firmware offline, then resealed his vault control panels with passive current disruptors that would disable them if touched without authorization. He didn't trust digital redundancy anymore. His safety now lay in latency, isolation, and the clarity of analog. By noon, a marked change occurred. A pair of new vehicles, white trucks with magnetic signage that read Property Compliance Services, appeared at the base of the gravel road. They didn't come to the gate. They parked 100 yards out, across the street, facing his land like silent observers. Two men in polos and utility belts stepped out and began walking along the edge of his tree line with tablets in hand, pausing every 20 feet to annotate or photograph something unseen. Andy didn't greet them. He didn't activate any warnings. Instead, he watched from his upstairs vantage point, taking his own photographs, documenting every timestamp, detail, and badge number visible through his scope. One of the men lifted a pair of compact binoculars, scanned the upper windows of Andy's home, then nodded to the other as if confirming they had been seen. Andy understood that gesture for what it was. Bait. They wanted him to engage, to step outside, to challenge them physically and verbally, all under high-definition lens so they could manipulate the footage later. He declined the invitation. 10 minutes later, they returned to the trucks and drove off slowly, but not before leaving behind a small tripod-mounted sensor just beyond the county marker stone. It wasn't disguised. That was the point. By mid-afternoon, 3 other residents from the edge of the unincorporated zone texted Andy. Word had gotten out about the surveillance. At least 2 reported receiving updated notices, this time bearing slightly more formalized language and referencing regional integration guidelines. One woman described a visit in which she was told her yard would be subject to a safety grading by third-party evaluators in cooperation with ongoing district upgrades. Andy urged them not to remove or destroy anything on their properties. Instead, he gave them guidance on how to document properly, who to email, and how to preserve chain of custody if they decided to pursue civil action later. He wasn't forming a resistance. He was reinforcing legal footing. That night, something new happened. Around 2:15 a.m., a low drone buzz echoed faintly over the roof of Andy's home. It wasn't one of his. His systems had already mapped the signature, and this one was unknown, flying low, quiet, but clearly scanning. It hovered for less than 90 seconds, then vanished. Andy reviewed the footage and confirmed it had briefly paused near his eastern roof vent, a non-critical location but still telling. Whoever sent it wasn't after imagery. They were testing signal bleed, measuring wireless echo, probing for vulnerability. The sophistication suggested a vendor-level asset, not a hobbyist. In the morning, Marla confirmed it. The drone was likely from a tactical scouting series used by private enforcement contractors in fire inspection and disaster insurance claims. Those devices weren't sold commercially. They had to be leased. That meant paperwork. She had already begun searching for fleet logs under cross-registered shell operators in the area. If she found the procurement trail, they'd have a name. But Andy knew the name wouldn't matter unless the pattern could be broken. The next escalation came not from the air or the edge of his land, but directly into his legal space. That Friday, a process server arrived unannounced with a formalized injunction. The document, nearly 20 pages long, accused Andy of interfering with regional development compliance efforts, and listed a number of vague infractions, including obstruction of environmental sensor calibration, failure to participate in community asset verification, and, the most egregious, intentional distortion of data streams relevant to public safety oversight. That last one was the dagger. It implied sabotage, subversion, possibly even tampering with protected networks. Anna reviewed the document within hours and called him in an agitated state, something rare for her. She explained that while most of the content was legally meaningless, the language mirrored pre-indictment scaffolding used in civil asset seizure proceedings. If the claim gained traction in court, a judge could be petitioned to issue an order allowing entry and inspection pending resolution. It wasn't about proving guilt. It was about lowering the threshold of resistance. Andy took a walk that evening, not to clear his mind, but to plan his terrain. He mapped alternative ingress points from the rear access trails, checked for unregistered motion activity, and reviewed power grid irregularities from the past 10 days. He found one anomaly, a power sag along the northern boundary that corresponded to the exact time the drone had flown overhead. That suggested a backdoor power siphon, possibly from a buried relay or modified transformer node. He marked the coordinates, logged the signature, and sealed the data in a hard capsule for redundancy. This wasn't paranoia. This was battlefield awareness. 3 nights later, the final push came. Just past midnight, 3 vehicles approached the road. 2 white service trucks and 1 unmarked SUV. They didn't stop at the gate. They drove straight up to the perimeter line, headlights off, hazard lights blinking slowly like beacons. 5 individuals emerged, 3 men, 2 women, all wearing the same non-standard utility uniforms. No visible weapons, no loudspeakers. One man approached the gate and rang the call box. Andy didn't respond. Instead, he recorded. The man rang again, then held up a clipboard with a paper that read, "Site reassessment. Involuntary entry imminent unless cooperation given." It was a bluff, but a dangerous one. Andy activated the exterior speaker. "This is private property. You have no legal standing. You are on recorded ground and have been documented. If you attempt forced entry, law enforcement and legal counsel will be notified instantly." No response. One of the women motioned to the others, then walked to the side of the gate and began examining the post where the hydraulic actuator was housed. Andy switched the camera angle. She had a tool kit. He activated the first-tier floodlights, flooding the front yard in hard, white clarity. The crew flinched. One of the men stepped back. Andy raised the speaker again. "You are making a recorded attempt to tamper with a licensed security system. You have 10 seconds to retreat before the footage is transmitted to state escalation lines." That did it. They hesitated, then slowly retreated. Not running, not panicked, just backing off, calm and measured, like players folding a weak hand in a high-stakes game. Within minutes, the vehicles reversed and disappeared into the dark. Andy stood in silence for a full 10 minutes afterward. He wasn't relieved. He wasn't proud. He knew exactly what this was. They weren't expecting to win. They were testing the limits of what they could get away with. And they were almost there. The next morning, Andy woke up to a silence that felt engineered. Too clean, too still, the kind that made the hair on his arms lift before he even left the bed. No birdsong, no passing tires from the distant highway, not even the usual rustle of branches scraping the northern fence. It was as if the environment itself had stepped back, bracing for something. The footage from the night before had already been backed up in 3 places, reviewed twice by both Anna and Marla, and logged with a private legal server with time-stamped integrity certification. But even as Andy moved through his routines, checking perimeters, reviewing passive sensor logs, ensuring that no new transmissions had spiked, he knew they weren't finished. That retreat hadn't been surrender. It had been recalibration. And if the previous assault was the pressure test, then what was coming next would be the real entry attempt. The legal route had failed, the psychological warfare had plateaued, and the intimidation, although bold, had revealed too much of their hand. They would have to pivot, and that meant escalation under the cover of procedural legitimacy. At 8:46 a.m., a marked sedan pulled into the gravel easement and stopped just outside his posted property boundary. Not one of the unmarked SUVs or fake compliance vans, but an actual government vehicle. City logo on the side, registration tag visible, driven by a man in plain clothes but wearing a lanyard with a municipal ID. He stepped out alone. No clipboard, no tablet, no entourage. Andy watched him through the lens of a long-range passive scope. The man didn't approach the gate. He stood outside it, pulled out his phone, and made a call. Moments later, Anna's phone rang. Andy patched in on the secure line and listened as the man introduced himself as a city liaison for property mediation, a role that didn't officially exist in their district records. He claimed he was sent to diffuse growing tensions between private residents and regional integration agents. He said he wasn't there to enforce anything, only to observe and report. Anna kept her voice neutral, asked for legal basis, and then for the source of the referral. He dodged the question twice before offering to set up a mutually agreeable time for reevaluation of community compliance thresholds. Anna cut him off, told him any further contact would need to go through legal channels, and that her client would not be participating in any unsanctioned re-evaluations. The man nodded once, even though he was still on the phone, then hung up, returned to his vehicle, and drove away. His tires didn't kick up dust. He wasn't in a hurry. That was the unsettling part. At noon, Marla sent Andy a red flag. The shell company previously identified in their investigation had filed an injunction against unknown parties in a different county, this time successfully. They had argued that refusal to participate in asset security grading posed imminent risk to regional infrastructure planning. The judge in that case, under incomplete information and pressured language, had allowed entry to the property with moderate oversight. Within days, the owner's firearms had been confiscated, listed as unsecured, and tied up in litigation that still hadn't resolved. The legal precedent was weak, but it existed now. Andy wasn't just defending his house anymore. He was defending every line of refusal that had held up until this moment. They weren't going to use brute force. They were going to use policy, distortion, and procedure. And if he allowed one step, it would cascade. At 3:17 p.m., his gate intercom buzzed. A voice, calm and smooth, identified himself as a representative of the State Public Readiness Task Force, a name that sounded official but had no records in any database. The man said they were preparing to conduct an emergency pre-assessment drill, involving properties that presented anomalous grid behavior and non-participation trends. Andy didn't answer. He watched as 3 men waited, one filming, one scanning the gate with a handheld device, and the third standing motionless with a printed clipboard of what looked like documents. When they received no response, they placed a laminated sign on the gate, marked with red lines and the words, temporary observation zone. Do not tamper. Then stepped back, took photographs, and left. Andy immediately removed the sign with gloves, scanned it, and stored it in his fireproof safe. Later, he sent the scan to a contact of Anna's, who confirmed it matched other fake signage used in 3 different states to fabricate inspection authority. It was now clear. They were going to manufacture justification for force if they couldn't get it through fear or law. At 5:02 p.m., a power fluctuation struck his grid. Not a blackout, just a momentary sag followed by 2 sharp pulses. Andy's system kicked into island mode, disengaging from the shared line and reverting to battery reserve. He checked the logs and found the source was not from the utility company but from an intermediary node, likely a modified regulator placed upstream. This wasn't an accident. It was a simulated failure, designed to create a pretext for service intervention. He patched the footage of the street transformer area to Marla, who confirmed that earlier in the day, one of the trucks posing as a utility vehicle had paused there for exactly 9 minutes. They had wired it to trigger a fault, probably scheduled for a later time, but prematurely activated. They were getting sloppy, or desperate. At 7:30 p.m., it happened. 3 vehicles, this time with actual badged personnel, wearing reflective vests and what appeared to be municipal access tags, arrived with a printed emergency utilities warrant, citing potential hazard to local infrastructure from a compromised energy relay on private land. One of the men stepped forward and announced through a handheld speaker that they were prepared to initiate a neutral entry and ask the homeowner to comply to avoid further escalation. Andy didn't speak. He didn't approach, but this time he was ready not just to document, but to demonstrate. He remotely activated his perimeter defense sequence, not violent, not trap-based, but purely visual and auditory. From concealed compartments in the ground, strobe-aligned lights emerged, casting angular shadow lines across the yard, while directional speakers emitted a low-frequency pulse designed not to injure, but to create unbearable disorientation. The effect was immediate. The lead man stumbled, the others reeled back. One tried to approach the gate and tripped a light sensor that flooded his entire path in a blinding wash of blue and white. Andy then activated the speaker system. This is a tactical demonstration of proprietary defense measures, deployed under lawful property rights, non-lethal, and fully recorded. You are advised to vacate immediately. Continued presence constitutes an illegal incursion and will be reported as such to state and federal oversight. The men didn't run, but they didn't stand their ground either. They backed up, shielding their faces from the light, their composure cracking. One of them dropped the warrant in the gravel. Another covered his ears and barked something at the driver, who was already reversing the lead vehicle. By the time they were back at the road, one of them had fallen to a knee, visibly disoriented. Another stumbled into the golf cart-style utility carrier parked nearby. They weren't acting like officers. They were acting like actors whose scene had gone sideways. Andy stood in the doorway, still silent. He didn't need to fire a shot. He had made them crawl back, not with weapons, but with competence. And now the whole thing was on record. The aftermath didn't arrive with headlines, nor did it carry apologies or admissions. It arrived as silence, a prolonged, eerie stillness where pressure had once pulsed constantly beneath the surface. The vehicles didn't return. The surveillance stopped. The faux legal correspondence ceased. No more laminated notices, no strange men at the gate, no drones passing silently overhead. But Andy understood better than most that silence was not absence. It was recalibration. The retreat wasn't surrender. It was damage control. Someone had calculated risk, weighed the optics of failure, and decided, for now, that continuing the operation against Andy Sloan would cost more than it was worth. His response hadn't just been defensive. It had been procedural, documented, legal, and executed with such deliberate restraint that no one on the other side could spin it into aggression. He hadn't fired a weapon. He hadn't made threats. He had held the line, methodically, publicly, and, most importantly, within the bounds of lawful resistance. And that, ironically, had made him untouchable for now. Within days, Marletta reported that several shell companies associated with the operation had begun dissolving quietly. Their registration links disappeared, websites went dark, contractor affiliations vanished from the searchable databases. It wasn't cleanup, it was retreat. A full-scale erasure operation, not to destroy evidence but to dissolve accountability. Anna filed a motion to freeze documents associated with the injunction they'd attempted to use against Andy, citing procedural manipulation and false jurisdictional filings. The judge agreed to review, but Andy knew the real win wasn't in court. The real win was that they didn't try again. The story ended not with a showdown, but with the quiet acknowledgement from his enemies that this door would not open, no matter how many keys they forged. Neighbors began to reach out, not out of fear, but out of curiosity. The stories had spread. Some had witnessed parts of the confrontation. Others had only heard what Andy's defense looked like through whispers and texts. He didn't give interviews. He didn't organize meetings or try to lead a movement. He shared what he knew, when asked, and directed people to the right legal channels, to the right forensic analysts, to the real laws buried under the noise of fake enforcement. And slowly, without fanfare, the pattern began to fracture. Across the county, property owners began pulling their records. Some filed reports. Some upgraded security. Some simply stopped complying with nonsense. The pressure that had once seemed like gravity began to lift. The silence spread, but this time it wasn't fear. It was attention. Awareness. One afternoon, several weeks later, Andy stood near the southern edge of his property, surveying a corner where he'd once found a buried device, now cleared, reseeded, and restored. He wasn't building fences anymore. He wasn't adding sensors or new defenses. He was just walking, quietly, without tension in his shoulders or weight in his chest. He had won. Not through retaliation, not through some cinematic display of violence, but by understanding the system better than those who sought to exploit it. He had weaponized documentation, patience, restraint. He had waited them out and made every step they took toward him cost more than it returned. He paused under the cedar tree where he'd once watched their golf cart idle like a vulture circling low. The wind moved through the branches with slow, hollow breath. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a bird called once, then fell silent again. The balance had shifted, not forever, but long enough. He would remain vigilant. The world had changed. Systems were shifting beneath the surface. But so long as there were people willing to stand quietly, deliberately, and without fear of being underestimated, there would be resistance. The kind that doesn't broadcast itself. The kind that doesn't seek applause. The kind that doesn't need a trigger to be dangerous. Andy Sloan walked back to his house, and somewhere, far from that stretch of gravel road, someone was updating a file with 2 words they hadn't expected to write beside his name. Non-viable target.